Ever since I can remember, I've always been obsessed with the concept of chance, and this is often reflected in my favorite characters. Two-Face will always be my favorite DC character, Bards will always be my favorite class in D&D, and while Gambit doesn't really have anything to do with chance, he'll still always be my favorite Marvel character because of his signature cards. My old IGN in all my games was actually Chance before I passed it on to my dog and adopted a new name. Moving on to League, I was always intrigued by TF because of his cards, and specifically his pick a card ability, which to untrained eyes seems like an ability of pure chance. I decided to pick him up and I fell in love with his playstyle, and I'm hoping that after this video, you all fall for him too. For runes, you have a few options, but generally speaking you want Hybrid Pen Reds, Armor Yellows, MR Blues, and Move Speed Quints. Hybrid Pen Reds are great on TF when you're playing against a melee or any champion who has equal or less range to you, because he has a very good auto attack trading through pick a card and stack deck. If you're playing against someone like Annie or Anivia though, there's no point in taking the extra armor pen and you're better off sticking with flat magic pen. If you can't afford to have a specialized rune page for them, don't worry, just stick with a flat magic pen. The move speed quints are an absolute must though, not only because TF's move speed is pretty abysmal naturally, but fast movement is absolutely essential for him to do his job, roam the map, catch out targets, and chase down people with gold cards. You also have a few options for masteries, but what everyone typically runs is a standard 2109 or 2190 build. 21 points in offense really solidifies your position as a quasi-assassin and gives you an extra boost of damage, which is why it's generally the best option for mid laners. 9 points into defense gives you a bit of extra defenses to survive burst lanes like Fizz or Annie, while 9 points into utility is a bit more of a greedier build, giving you extra move speed, reduced summoner spell cooldown, and longer buff duration. Essentially, if you think you're safe enough in a lane to go with 9 points in utility, then you should. However, something that I've had a lot of success with is a 9-0-21 build. Basically what this gives you is massive ganking potential with slightly less damage. You'll hit your level 6 earlier, you'll have extra CDR to throw out stuns more often, and more importantly, you'll have a huge amount of movement speed. Sure, you miss out on some damage, but honestly, damage isn't the most important factor for TF. All you need to do is port to a lane, throw out a gold card, and your teammates will do the damage for you. As a support and jungle main, this build fits my roaming style, and it's a large part of the reason why I'm so successful at TF. For summoner spells, you absolutely need flash, but the second spell is dependent on matchups and how safe you want to be. Ignite is generally the best option because it gives you an extra amount of burst to finish off kills and snowball your advantage, but barrier is a great option versus burst counter lanes like Fizz or Annie. In rare situations, cleanse is a good option too, primarily against Ashe because taking arrows to the face isn't good for your health. Unlike a lot of champions in the game currently, you actually have a lot of options for starting items with TF. Doran's Blade as Surface is a pretty good start for mid champions with good auto attack animations, good auto attack trading abilities, or high auto attack ranges, some prime examples being Anivia, Annie, LeBlanc, Orianna, and TF. Obviously the bad part about starting with the Doran's Blade is that you're not able to pick up any consumables, but it does allow you to bully the enemy laner out of the lane in some situations. This typically only works for TF against melee champions like Eve or Talon, and it can be a dangerous start against melee champions like Fizz unless you're able to bully them extremely hard at levels 1 to 2. Doran's Ring is pretty much the standard for most AP mids at this point because it provides you with all the stats you need, but it does still share a drawback with all the Doran's items, no war at level 1. Generally speaking, this is why you don't want to roll with any of the Doran's items when you're playing against a very effective early game ganker like Jarvan. That being said, in rare situations, you may get put up against an AD carry mid that will push you into your tower and harass you all day with auto attacks, and Doran's Shield is actually a viable option in this case. It gives you a ton of health, a ton of regen, and the block passive is amazing. Doran's Shield is actually pretty overpowered right now, but it's still a very niche item. Aside from the Doran's items, you have a few other options to choose from. The first is Crystalline Flask, which is a really fits-all start. It works for aggressive play, it works for passive play, and more importantly, it allows you to start at the war when you're playing against aggressive junglers or simply want to play more aggressive in your lane. The last star is Boots of Speed, but similar to Doran's Shield, it's a pretty niche start. It works well versus skill shot dependent champions like Morgana and Lux, but with all the extra movement speed you already have, it's kind of overkill at that point, especially if you choose to go with the utility build. Moving on to the rest of the build, you still have a plethora of options. I'll start with my personal favorite, which is Twin Shadows. Not only is it the best option for ganking because of the slow movement speed, but it also provides you with some MR to make you beefier against magic damage. It's also the cheapest option out of any others by far at only 1900 gold, so it's a huge power spike in the early game. That being said, this start obviously lacks in damage, and sometimes it's better to rush for more single target damage and faster tower pushing via Lich Bane. Not only does it give you more damage, but similar to Twin Shadows, it also gives you extra movement speed. In addition to that, it increases your mana pool, which can be a really limiting factor for TF in some situations. But sometimes you're not looking for extra damage and you're simply looking for survivability, which is where Zhonya's comes in. Despite what some people may think, rushing Zonias isn't something that's only viable against AD casters. It's actually a very important item versus Fizz specifically, in addition to Lux or other burst casters. You can use Zonias while Fizz's ultimate is on you, and you can also use Zonias through Lux's binding to block her triple spell burst combo, effectively ignoring their biggest sources of damage. Zonias also turns TF into a pseudo-initiator by teleporting into the enemy team, begging them into thinking he's an easy kill, and then using Zonias to soak their skill shots or ultimates. The last two builds are something I don't endorse personally, but some people do like them. Deathcap obviously gives you the highest amount of AP for the price, and it will spike your wave clear and poking abilities, but it doesn't offer too much in terms of utility, and offers nothing in terms of defenses. Lastly, DFG just seems like a worse version of Lichbane to me personally because it doesn't provide you with any mana, move speed, or extra tower pushing, but your overall burst on a single target will be higher with DFG, and you can't forget about the extra CDR. So far I've discussed all the first item options, but what does the typical item progression look like? Well, for starters, you want to start by rushing 1 to 2 Doran's Rings and Sorcerer's Shoes. Like we talked about earlier, movement speed is incredibly important on TF, so upgrading your boots as early as possible is the best option. After you've purchased your first item, your second item should always be Lichbane, unless, of course, your first item was Lichbane. Lichbane is really what TF gets a lot of his damage from because of his two primary abilities have very low cooldowns, and unlike a lot of AP champions, he actually has an incentive to auto attack because pick a card and stack deck, so he's able to utilize Lichbane very well. If you decide to go with Lichbane as your first item, your second item is typically going to be Zonias or Deathcap, depending on the situation. Void Staff is usually a good pickup as your third item, but if you need defenses or initiation and the enemy team doesn't have a decent amount of MR, Zonias is always a good option, assuming you didn't buy it first. I'll tell you right now that I rush Twin Shadows into Lichbane about 80% of my games because I think the extra utility that you get through these two items is just insane. I rush Zonias 10% of the time due to matchups, and the other 10% of the time I'll go for Lichbane first because I'm behind early on and already past the time for getting early Twin Shadows. Ultimately, a lot of it boils down to preference and what you're comfortable with. TF is a very flexible champion and you have to find what works best for you. Skill order, like most champions, is pretty self-explanatory. R over Q over W over E. That is, max wildcards first, then pick a card, then stack deck, and obviously skill up your ultimate whenever you can. You want to take pick a card at level 1, wildcards level 2, and stack deck at level 3. Having pick a card at level 1 is really useful for a lot of situations. Level 1 invade with gold card, harassing in lane with blue card, and pushing in lane early on with red card. Now that we've gone through all the technical stuff, we can get into how you should play the game out as TF. If you watch my Blitz video, you'll know that I tell my team to invade every game no matter what, and that's no different with TF. TF took a huge hit to his invade power at the recent nerf to his pick a card, but he's still a very strong invader if you have a champion that can throw out the first CC, or if you simply get lucky and RNG a gold card. Gold card is only a 1 second stun at rank 1, but it's still enough to secure kills, and red card is ridiculous AoE damage and slow in an all-out 5v5 brawl at level 1. TF has one of the strongest laning phases in the game 1v1 because of his versatility, but junglers can really give him a hard time. A jungler like Jarvan especially can sit mid and ruin your day, so you often have to play a bit more passive if you're up against a gank heavy jungler, or tell your jungler to counter gank your lane. Aside from junglers though, TF has the ability to shove lanes really hard, which is primarily what decides who wins mid in a lot of cases. If you're able to push the lane, you force the enemy laner to take a ton of minion damage if he looks to trade with you, and you also make it much harder for him to CS by pushing to his tower. In addition to his ability to push, he also essentially has free harass through blue cards and stack deck. Red carding the range creeps will make range champions afraid to approach their minion wave, while constantly auto-attacking and blue carding melee champions will make it impossible for them to CS without taking huge amounts of damage. There are some melee champions you have to be afraid of though. For example, Fizz takes less damage from auto attacks, is able to move through minions, is able to avoid your cards, and also does huge amount of burst damage. Diana is another champion that can give you some trouble because of her shield and ability to push. At level 6 you have to be incredibly careful because she will kill you in a split second, though this is the case for a lot of champions. So if we get stomped at level 6 by a lot of mid laners, what are we supposed to do? Gank. Duh. TF really stops caring about laning phase after level 6 because he's able to influence his other lanes to make up for his poor individual laning phase post 6. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that TF has relatively low base mana, having only 430 at level 6, and his ultimate costs 150 mana at ranked 1. His full combo, including ultimate, costs over 60% of his mana pool at level 6, so be sure you have an appropriate amount of mana before you go in for a gank. Typically what I like to do is back soon after I hit level 6, heal, and run straight to bottom with my new items, preferably upgraded boots. For whatever reason, a lot of people don't suspect that TF will gank immediately after you back, so they feel safe and you're able to pick off easy kills that start to snowball the game out of control. You also preferably don't want to use your ultimate before you get blue buff so you can take advantage of the CDR. TF's ultimate has a 3-minute cooldown at rank 1, and the 29% CDR you get from utility masteries and blue buff brings that down almost an entire minute, which is huge. As the mid game continues, you just want to keep farming up your items and be relentless with your ganks. Every single time your ultimate is up, you should be looking for gank opportunities. Push out the wave mid with wildcards and red card, and run towards Wraith or Wolves. Running towards the camps gives you a position to gank a side lane, and if the opportunity doesn't present itself, you can simply farm the camp, run back to mid, and rinse and repeat. Every time you walk out of vision, everyone on the other team has to play passive because they have to respect the threat of your ultimate. As you move into the late game, TF becomes a huge split push threat because of his ability to push towers incredibly fast with Lichbane and pick a card. He'll also look to pick off a single player and then force a big objective with a number advantage. TF essentially says nope to any split pushers because if you have someone split pushing against your team split pusher, they're 100% free kill in the mid to late game because TF can turn a 1v1 into 2v1 in the blink of an eye. Teams are forced to stick together and cower in fear of TF's ultimate unless they're severely ahead in gold. Anytime the AD carry tries to farm a side lane, it's a free kill for TF unless they have QSS or cleanse, in which case it's a little bit tougher. Once TF gets items, he acts as a pseudo-assassin with his 220% AP ratio and 2-second stun, and absolutely no AD carry can stand up to him without a well-timed QSS or cleanse. TF is a late game monster not only because he's good in 1v1 situations, but because the fear of destiny limits the options of the enemy team. In terms of how to play out a fight, 1v1s are pretty self-explanatory because gold carding and wild cards followed by auto attacks is always the best option, but in the scope of a team fight, how does TF get in range to use his cards effectively without dying? TF usually functions by weaving in and out of the team fight, sniping off important targets, or using his gold cards to peel for himself while he kites backwards. Auto attacks will amount to a lot of damage because of a stacked deck, but getting off extra auto attacks at the cost of taking a ton of damage is definitely not worth it. Generally speaking, you want to stay on the outskirts of the team fight and throw out wild cards until you find your opportunity to swoop in and burst someone down. Flashing in to get the kill on the enemy AD carry is typically worth it in the late game because of the relative power levels, especially if you have a Zonias to follow up with afterwards. If you're fighting in the jungle and you have poor ward coverage, use your ultimate to give you vision and potentially snipe out the AD carry in the backline. Alternatively, if the team fight is clearly lost, use your ultimate to teleport to a side lane to take towers or inhibitors, also referred to as pussying out or being an annoying bitch. So we've gone through all the basics you need to know to succeed with TF, but there are a few more advanced tactics or things you need to know to truly be a god at TF and hit Messiah level. Okay, maybe not Messiah level, but maybe like Link level. For starters, despite what drew me to TF in the first place, pick a card is actually not random at all. The clock is constantly ticking, and if you're incredibly determined to do so, you can actually know what card is going to pop up first every single time, introducing a new surprise factor because you draw and pick the card you want almost instantly. There's speculation that Messiah does this, but honestly, I don't see much point to it. Instead, train yourself to react to the colors quickly so you don't miss out on the first gold card and have to sit through an entire rotation. Admittedly, I don't have the best reaction times, but sometimes it's the difference between life and death, so be sure to practice it. Last patch, TF received a nerf to his pick a card ability that causes the card you picked to only last for 4 seconds now instead of the previous 10 seconds. This is actually a pretty big nerf because you don't have the intimidation factor of holding a gold card in lane anymore, and you also have a much smaller window to pick your card when you teleport in for a gank. Gate takes 1.5 seconds to channel, add in an extra second or so of locking the card you want before you teleport, and you've only got 1 to 2 seconds to get off your auto attack before the card times out. So what can you do to fix this? Well, there's a little trick that not a lot of people know and not many people care to learn because it didn't matter too much before the nerf. You can actually lock a card while you're channeling Gate, which increases the window you have to throw out your card by a huge amount. Activate Pick a Card, use Destiny, Gate to the position, and watch the cards rotate at the bottom of your screen. Lock the gold card and you're good to go. It's going to feel really weird the first few times, but you'll get used to it eventually. A lot of people think that the gold card is always the best, but it's important to realize that each card has its uses. Blue card does the most damage and is great for securing last hits in the early game, harassing your lane opponent, and killing towers or objectives like Dragon or Baron. Red card is the best for pushing lanes at any stage in the game, and it's also incredibly useful for kiting in team fights. At max rank, red card slows for 50% for 2.5 seconds in an AoE. It's honestly one of the best slows in the game, and it's incredibly underrated. And then we have the gold card, which is obviously the best for single target killing potential because of the stun that it provides. It's the only 2-second targeted stun ability left in the game after both Taric and Silence were nerfed quite a long time ago, which almost forces the enemy team into buying Tenacity, similar to playing against the Fiddle or Rammus. The difference between good and great TF players is knowing how to utilize every single card instead of constantly logging gold cards. This is going to sound like a really obvious tip, but it's one of the biggest things I noticed in lower elo TF players, so I feel like I have to mention it. While your cards are cycling, you're able to auto attack, and it's incredibly important that you do so because of stacked deck. I know it feels weird and may be difficult to be cycling through cards, auto attacking, choosing the right card, throwing wild cards, and kiting all at the same time, but it's just something that you're going to have to get used to. Obviously there are times you don't want to auto attack because it'll put you in a bad position, but you get what I mean. Also, you can choose cards while you're stunned so long as pick a card is already activated, so keep that in mind and don't panic when you get CC'd. Zhonya's Hourglass is one of the best utility items you can buy in TF, and there's a few different uses for it. The first use is obviously for blocking important abilities like Zed's Deathmark or Fizz's Chum the Waters. If you don't have a Zhonya's against either of these champions, you're going to have a real bad time. The second use is using it for initiation, which sounds odd and it's only used like this in rare situations, but using Gate in the middle of their team and then using Zhonya's immediately after baits out some important skill shots or ultimates and allows the rest of your team to catch up and destroy them. The third use is kind of the initiation bait, in which you Zhonya's just before your gate goes through, which cancels the teleport. Similar to the initiation strategy, this will bait out some skill shots and potentially some ultimates and allow your team to catch up and win the team fight while their abilities are on cooldown. Another neat trick with Zhonya's is that, similar to how you can cycle through cards through stuns, you can also choose cards while you're in stasis, which makes an incredibly good stalling tool if you have someone on top of you and draw a blue card first. The last tip is to annoy the hell out of your opponents. Frustrate them. Make them crumple under the immense amount of pressure that is a good TF player. If any of you have ever played against a good TF or watched a tournament game with TF, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Be relentless with your pushing, gank bottom lane every single time your ultimate is up, and keep disappearing off the map to keep them scared. You want everyone on the other team to feel utterly helpless at every point in time because they know that you're just waiting to ult to their lane and kill them. And your lane knows that if they leave, their tower is going to die. TF is a relentless and unforgiving champion, and that's exactly what you need to embody while you're playing him. Now that you know everything you know about TF, go out on solo queue and get some free elo. I almost never get to play him anymore in rank nowadays because of how much he's banned in high elo, so if you're not in diamond or potentially plat, take advantage of him not being banned while you can. TF is a playmaker and it's incredibly important to communicate with your team, so consider checking out my video on being an effective leader also. Anyway, that's it for me guys. Thanks for watching, good luck in your games, and I'll see you all next time.